Welcome everyone to this webinar on data cleanup in ArchivesSpace. Just so you're aware, unlike our regular webinars, this will be a very special 90-minute episode. It is an understatement to say that most of us are doing our jobs under much different conditions than usual. As a browser-based system you can access from anywhere, ArchivesSpace is a tool that can be used when working remotely. And many ArchivesSpace users are finding themselves executing large-scale data cleanup projects that have only recently been prioritized. In this webinar, ArchivesSpace users from a variety of institutions will explain metadata remediation and maintenance projects at their institutions and offer tools and strategies for working with duplicate records, legacy description, and non-standard metadata, and renumbering and adding information to boxes and folders, i.e. top containers and subcontainers. Projects to be discussed include name authority remediation, addressing duplicate agent and subject records, improving date metadata, and uploading EAD finding aids while managing staff working in ArchivesSpace remotely. We will hold all questions until the Q&A session at the end, though you may type a question into the Q&A panel at any time. Your presenters today are Abby Haverstock, Megan O'Riordan, Alex Durye, Rachel Searcy, and Alicia Detelich. Abby Haverstock is the Senior Archivist in the Western History and Genealogy Department of the Denver Public Library. The department is steward of about 5,500 manuscript collections in a busy downtown public library where access by anyone without an appointment is their strength. Megan O'Riordan has served as the accessioning archivist for the Stuart A. Rose Manuscript Archives and Rare Book Library at Emory University since 2016. Previously, she was a library associate at North Carolina State University. Rachel Searcy is the accessioning archivist and an ArchivesSpace administrator at New York University Libraries, working in the Archival Collections Management Department. Previously, Rachel held positions focusing on processing, metadata, and digitization at NYU's Tamiment Library and Robert F. Wagner Labor Archives and the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum. Alex Durye is the metadata archivist at the New York Public Library, where he manages and develops systems for architectural description and discovery. Alicia Detelich is a metadata archivist in the Manuscripts and Archives Department at Yale University Sterling Memorial Library. Her work is focused on developing tools and workflows for creating and enhancing archival description. Thank you all so much for being here. And Abby, if you'd like to start us off.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for attending today. We appreciate it. Today, I'm going to be talking about how the Denver Public Library Archives team has turned a task that was really a side project into the focal point of our work from home by tweaking some processes and widening our circle of contributors during this work from home situation that we all find ourselves in. To provide a little project background, in 2017, Lyrasis completed a migration for Denver Public Library of all of our collection level MARC records to ArchivesSpace resource records. Lyrasis also crosswalked our approximately 550 EAD finding aids to ArchivesSpace. Since all of our collections have a collection level record in our catalog, it was a terrific start for us because it allowed us to have a collection level placeholder for each of our records in ArchivesSpace. But the real work was yet to come, and a lot of challenges remained after the initial migration of data. Our biggest challenge was that our new ArchivesSpace records didn't include any information about what was in our collections, since that granular level of information had never been really part of the MARC data. Information about collection contents was still locked up within the individual legacy finding aids on Word documents that had been created over the previous 30 years or so. And some of our really old legacy finding aids from the 1980s, of course, like I'm sure some of you can probably have the same situation in your archives, they lived only on paper, so that we didn't even have a digital document to work with. Formatting in any of these inventories varied really widely across the board. So when we did the ingest, we also hadn't settled on a number of important collection management fields in our use of fields in ArchivesSpace. So once we got to know our ArchivesSpace system better, we had to update some of the boilerplate statements that we had applied during ingest. Another thing that we wanted to do was to use our locations a little bit better. We kind of came to committing to locations late in the game. Some of the earliest records that we completed had no instances at all. So it took us a while to figure out how to automate creating locations, to get those in place. So that left some messes that also needed cleaning up. So I think the words came to my mouth, out of my mouth once or twice, that if only we could stop doing everything else and just finish adding the metadata from our inventories. Well, be careful what you wish for, because of course we are faced with just this scenario right now. We have stopped doing so much of what makes us tick in a public library. But well before the library closed due to the pandemic, we were asked to prepare draft work from home tasks. We knew that we could enlist many of our non-archivist colleagues within the department's team to help us structure our inventory data, because we had developed this process already for our many volunteers who help us accession new collections in our normal course of work. So why not use this volunteer workflow to structure the inventory data from our old collections? So we used Harvard's EAD spreadsheet, EAD to ArchivesSpace spreadsheet, but we customized it to look a little bit more like the inventory files that our volunteers and our staff were used to. So this is an example of a legacy inventory that we created in Microsoft Word over the course of the last several decades, and it shows you all the metadata points that the form asks us to input. So we basically created a kind of cover sheet for the Harvard spreadsheet that mimicked those fields I just showed you in the old Microsoft Word inventories. And normally our volunteers would complete this entire cover sheet for a new accession or accrual. But for the work from home project, we asked the staff that were new to contribute to our project to just write down or just input the unique identifier and the title for administrative purposes. That was so staff could keep the collection numbers and titles straight in all the work they were doing. The second page of the spreadsheet, and the one developed by Harvard, really resembles our container inventory. But it requires that the data be structured, of course. That's the big difference. So once the data has been entered into the spreadsheet by one of our colleagues, it goes back to an archivist who will later apply the XML code that's embedded in the Harvard spreadsheet, convert the coding to a text file, and then upload the text file to ArchivesSpace, where it becomes a resource record. So as soon as we learned of our closure date, we needed to quickly put the work from home drafts that we had prepared into action. So I created a folder for each of the new contributors to our project on a shared drive. I added spreadsheet templates and I uploaded the inventories that they would be working on. This way I'd have access to their finished spreadsheets and I could upload more when they needed more inventories to work on. And I trained the people that I could in person before we left, but the rest were trained virtually over phone and Google Meet. And there have been a lot of follow-up questions, of course. I think that's important to support the questions that come up once you kind of get your feet wet with the data migration project. You get a lot of questions that you can't prepare for in the beginning. So it's a matter of being in constant touch. But I did add 2 of our cataloging assistants, 2 of our shelvers to our team that's working on the ArchivesSpace project. And by adding these 4 people to the project, I grew our team by about 60%. It's definitely a different workflow now, and the work still needs to be looked at by an archivist. The archivist still needs to complete the collection level administrative data, like preferred citation and use statements and things like that. But the most time-intensive work in those spreadsheets is complete. And now I'm prepared to train more people on staff if I need to, if we're still working from home. So of course our project output increased. Here's a graph that shows some numbers of collections that we migrated in just the past few weeks. We've reviewed and updated almost 600 collections just since mid-March. Our progress to date before we left for work from home was, as you can see, about 1,150 finding aids complete or resource records completed. And now we're up to 1,719. So a huge increase in work. So in an imperfect work climate as this is, we found a project that was a great fit for working remotely, helping with ArchivesSpace data migration without even touching ArchivesSpace. ArchivesSpace isn't something you can teach somebody in about an hour, but most people are familiar enough with spreadsheets to get busy with those pretty quickly. So to review, we applied what we knew from teaching our volunteers to move inventories into spreadsheets. We adapted our existing processes to fit our new challenges, our new working conditions. And we identified more staff who needed tasks to do or who might have been at risk of being redeployed. Some takeaways. Cross-training is really beneficial in so many ways. We can do better work with a more diverse team. For instance, one member of our team is among our regular bloggers in our department. She wrote a blog about our work from home processes, and she made it really interesting because she's a really good writer, which is how the Lyrasis team contacted us in the first place about this webinar. With a smaller team, we might not have been able to take the time to publicize our work. Making a wider share of a mundane task is really good. No one person can move data around all day, but staff members who are working on our project have commented to me that they enjoy having this task as part of their work from home. They like the sense of completion that they get doing this task. In a time when everything else is up in the air, or we are planning for scenarios that are in limbo, this is a finite, satisfying task. I've followed through with our new team members to show them the completed uploaded work that they have been doing for us. And they get to see that their work is finished and up on the public user interface. I think they get a sense of accomplishment by seeing their work publicized. And I assure them that thanks to their help, we may not have to touch that record again. It's done. And the most important takeaway of all, I think, is that we need to help our colleagues contribute when there is so much uncertainty in our lives. Our work as archivists is always fundamentally about people, and that includes our researchers and our students or other end users, but that also includes our teams and the work we are doing today. So I hope this presentation might inspire you to apply some of these people-centered ideas in your work from home. And good luck to you all in the important work that you are doing in this difficult time. Thank you.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for having me today to talk about the data cleanup that I've been doing in ArchivesSpace. I will start with a little background for context before moving on to process, results, lessons learned, and the next steps and projects I'll be working on. As was mentioned, I am Megan O'Riordan, and I am the accessioning archivist for the Stuart A. Rose Manuscript, Archives, and Rare Book Library. The Rose Library is one of 5 special collections repositories at Emory University, and as our longer name suggests, University Archives is also a part of our library. The Emory University Library's repositories implemented ArchivesSpace as a cross-repository collection management tool in the fall of 2018. Prior to this implementation, each repository managed their collection information using a variety of tools. Though the largest repository, the Rose Library, with the exception of University Archives, was not using a centralized tool, but rather a combination of tools to create a homegrown system. All of the repositories participate in Emory finding aids as the discovery tool, so all repositories have finding aids encoded in EAD, but accession information, when it existed, was in different tools. The Rose Library used a Microsoft Access database. Emory University Archives and Pitt's Theology Library used different Archivist Toolkit instances, and the other repositories either did not have accession information or only had it in paper form. This is important because we implemented ArchivesSpace using a phased approach, and phase 1 was for accessioning only. This means our first migration was focused primarily on accession data, though we did also migrate Emory finding aids to create resource records in order to link accession records to collections. After migration, I noticed right away that there were many duplicate agent records. It isn't clear to me exactly what happened. Maybe every agent from each finding aid and each accession record in both our database and the 2 AT instances were migrated, regardless of how much they matched or not. Even if some matching was attempted, multiple records could have still been created because of human error. For example, in our Access database, the source name is a plain text field, and we were not consistent about how we formed names in that field. We had a month after migration during which we froze accessioning precisely so that we could do activities like a data check, but the agent record problem was too big of an issue to solve during that time period, which also included training everyone on using the system. I thought about the project off and on over the following 1.5 years, but I never had the capacity to put the project together to fix the agents. I sometimes would fix instances of duplicates as I came across them during the course of accessioning, but a systematic project was still on the back burner. Then came the pandemic. I needed viable work from home projects, and cleaning up ArchivesSpace, starting with agents, was top of my list of ideas. Long before that moment, when I was first thinking about the problem, I created some reports and spreadsheets from ArchivesSpace, and it seemed to me like the issue in solving the agent records was that ArchivesSpace couldn't produce a spreadsheet of the information I needed. I began by thinking about fixing all of the agent records across repositories. One of the only 2 reports specifically related to agent records is the name records list. But that report only gives a list of agents attached to records in the repository you're in, and only gives 3 columns of information: sort name, name type, and name source. I could use it to check for duplicates in the manuscript repository for Rose Library, but not across repositories. And I couldn't see all of the information I needed to know about the agent records, such as contact details. I could also generate a CSV from the browse view of agent records, which was slightly more helpful. At least that would get me a comprehensive list of unique agents to check for duplicates, but it still did not contain the contact details information. Still, with an indefinite time to work from home, I decided to start from the CSV. I ran it through OpenRefine to try to put all the duplicates together, but it was still an overwhelming task to sort through over 8,000 records. What really set me on the course of the project was talking it through with our metadata specialist, Elizabeth Rossi-Roque. She reminded me that we would eventually re-import the EAD from the finding aids as part of phase 2. So I didn't really need to dedupe or clean up agents attached to resource records. Any work I did on those agents would need to be done again at some future point and wouldn't be a good use of my time. So what we really needed was a list of agents that were linked as sources to accession records. We would not be re-importing any accession record information during phase 2, so any cleanup of those specific agent records would be more useful work, most of which wouldn't be duplicated at a later point. Now we knew how to make the project manageable and more productive, but I still didn't know how we would get that list. Luckily, I took one last look at reports, and I noticed that there was a report called Accessions and Linked Subjects, Names, and Classifications. Rose Library accession records don't have subjects or classifications linked to them, and none of the ones that we migrated had creators because of how data had been structured in the Access database. Any agent linked to an accession record should be a source for the most part. I knew this would be the closest list to what I needed. The total number of agents when I started was 8,661. This report yielded a list of 2,370 names. This distinction between agents and names is important. I still couldn't use this list to look for duplicates because it lists every name form for every agent attached to an accession record, even if it's the same agent record. So I didn't go from 8,661 unique agent records to 2,370 unique agent records, but at least that number was cut by 75%. I could also cut it a little bit down from that because the report has a names function field that indicates if it's a source, creator, or something else. So I could delete all of the names that weren't linked as sources. And thus started my 3-week journey from March 23rd to April 14th, during which about 90% of my 40 hours per week were focused on this project. Really, all I could do after I had this list was search each name in ArchivesSpace and merge it with duplicates one by one, checking for correct information along the way. I learned a few things about what had happened during our migration through this project. For one thing, all of the source agents migrated from the Access database were migrated as person records, even though many of them would be considered corporate entities. I don't know that we could have asked them to migrate the information differently, but this is a problem because you can't merge different types of agent records. The only way for me to change these person records into corporate entity records was to create a new corporate entity record and then relink all of the accession, resource, and event records attached to the original person record to the new corporate entity record. This is messy and risky. I did it for most of them, in particular because some of them are attached to resource records, but I still have 16 person records that should be corporate entity records because there are so many accession records attached to them that I am worried about losing the links. There's an example on the slide of Between the Covers, which has 34 linked records on it. In fact, during the assessment period of this project, I learned that I had lost about 20 to 30 agent links to accession records as a result of the workaround, and I had to go back in and reestablish them. The second thing I learned about our migration is that the source for the name form on the agent records was migrated incorrectly for most agents. All of the source agents that migrated from the Access database came over with a name form source as unspecified ingested source. Even from finding aids, if the EAD was enhanced to include VIAF information, then VIAF was the source associated with the name form. But if the enhancement wasn't there in the EAD, the source was listed as Library of Congress name authority file. But if it had an authority record, we would have done the VIAF enhancement. So there's a lot of agent records in our ArchivesSpace instance that seem like they have authority records, but they don't. If I was already fixing an agent record, I fixed this source issue as well, but I only fixed it on other agents if a name form source we would never use, such as unspecified ingested source, was used. Finally, not only were contact details not parsed, but the phone numbers in the Access database didn't migrate at all. I think this is because the telephone number field in ArchivesSpace is really a subrecord of the contact details record, so the information didn't know where to go. The only automated solution to this would have been to re-import the data from the Access database, which would have been a good option at the start of my project. But by the time I realized what had happened, I felt I had already done too much work to go backwards. So I ultimately entered telephone numbers one by one, using a PDF of all the accession records from the Access database, as well as acquisitions paperwork we keep electronically on a shared drive. This wasn't as tedious as it sounds, as many of these source agents didn't provide a phone number in the first place, or had since passed away, or what have you. So it was tedious, but not as bad as it sounds. Most satisfying was getting rid of ridiculous sources like X or unknown, or one of my favorites that you can see here on the screen, Ask David. In the Access database, source name was required, so archivists had to enter something, and the migration turned these fillers into agent records. I'm also grateful that we're in a more structured data environment now, because we'll never be at risk for misspelling or misforming a name ever again, or at least we'll always all misspell it the same way. You can see that we had 4 different ways of dealing with Glenn Horowitz from the Access database. I did end up fixing many creator records in the end, since often the creator is also the source. These agents are also attached to resources, and they will be re-imported during phase 2, but this duplicative work couldn't be avoided, and we will know which record is most correct after we re-import and can just merge them again. In the end, I eliminated 1,264 duplicate agent records. I corrected around 1,000 records that had an incorrect name form source, such as unspecified ingested source. I corrected around 200 records that were coded as the wrong type, such as corporate entities that had person records. And I also corrected all of the Emory University and Emory College agents to match Library of Congress Name Authority File, or DAX. Most of what I learned from doing this project was what I want from ArchivesSpace agent records in the future. In terms of functionality, a few changes would have made this process easier. I wish I could change the record type or merge different types of records. It was a lot of work to relink new agent records, as well as being risky, so risky that I still haven't fixed all of them. I wish I could merge multiple agent records at once rather than one at a time, or at least not have to compare every pair of agent records. I also wish I could customize reports so that I could have generated a report more tailored to what I needed to do. I was glad to only work from a list of 2,300 names, but I think even that list could have been cut in half if I could have made the report more specific. In terms of how the agent records are formed, I wish the contact details subrecord had drop-down menus for the state and country fields. I found myself misspelling state names from time to time just by a slip of a keystroke. We also deal with international donors and sellers, and I found it tricky to enter their address in the fields clearly designed with the US context in mind. I wish that if there were a drop-down and I changed it to a different country, the fields would also change to be more appropriate for how a given country structures their contact details. For next steps, I'm basically done with agent records until we complete phase 2 migration. When we re-import EAD, I will need to dedupe agents linked as creators and subjects. We can do some EAD cleanup ahead of time too. For example, some of the agents that don't have the right type are a result of EAD encoding. So I think we can run a report from our XML to fix those for next time. Subject management will be dependent on what the cross-repository group decides as part of policy and workflow. Now that I'm at a stopping point with agents, I'm also working on 2 additional projects related to ArchivesSpace data cleanup. The first project is thinking about how to get pre-2000 accession record information into ArchivesSpace. All pre-2000 records are in paper form and were not added to the Access database. However, many, or maybe even most of them, were scanned into an electronic collection file that I can access from home. I grabbed this one today for the screenshot. So I'm thinking of ways to get this data into ArchivesSpace in a less labor-intensive way than straight transcription. The second project I'm already actively working on is creating a spreadsheet of our containers in order to match container profiles to containers we will import from the EAD during phase 2. I began with a spreadsheet of containers generated from our ILS ALMA based on holdings records. I then structured the spreadsheet to mirror the fields in the top container record in ArchivesSpace. You can see I have tabs for manuscript collection containers university archives collection containers, container profiles, locations, and location profiles. Before this spreadsheet, the only way to know the container profile for a box was on our paper barcode files. We barcoded all of our collections when we opened an offsite storage facility called the Library Service Center, or LSC, back in 2016. One barcode went on the container and one on a form, making it easier to scan into ALMA and also creating a paper trail of this action. On this form is a place to mark what kind of container the box is. As you can imagine, since all of these files were created by humans, there is a lot of error in them. Luckily, the LSC's system keeps track of container type for space management purposes, so I was able to match my spreadsheet against a report from their system for containers stored at the LSC, but that didn't capture containers that are on site that were marked incorrectly or not at all in the barcode files. As of today, I have made it through all 1,498 manuscript collections, most of which have a barcode file. There are 25,855 containers in the spreadsheet, and 22,993 now have an assigned container type, for a result of 89% that I was able to match from the barcode files and the spreadsheet from the LSC. For another sort of metric for archivists, I took home 6.5 linear feet of barcode files, and 5.5 of that is manuscript collections. The other foot is university archives. The rest of the containers will have to be assigned when we return to campus and I can look at them in person. I'll now be moving on to university archives containers next, which includes 302 collections and 2,583 containers. So that is how I've been working on data cleanup in ArchivesSpace, along with my dog, Oliver. And I look forward to more discussion and answering any questions you may have. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Rachel Searcy, and I'm the accessioning archivist at NYU, where I'm also an ArchivesSpace administrator. And I'm going to continue along the same thread as Megan. So today I'm going to talk about a project we completed to merge over 3,600 duplicate agent and subject terms, correct almost 1,000 individual entries for standards compliance, and decrease the number of agent records in our system by over 16%. So like most, we work with both newly created and legacy archival data, and each present their own challenges and opportunities. From 2008 to 2016, NYU Special Collections used Archivist Toolkit to manage our collections. 3 repositories, Fales Library and Special Collections, New York University Archives, and the Tammet Library and Robert F. Wagner Labor Archives each had their own AT database, as well as their own staff, reading room, and workflows. In 2016, we migrated to ArchivesSpace and chose to migrate the 3 AT databases into a single ArchivesSpace instance with 3 repositories. We wanted to share records across the repositories and take a more consistent approach to our work generally. And we knew that this decision would have metadata management implications. During migration, we categorized different kinds of data cleanup work as either critical to implementation or merely nice to have. Something was critical if it caused an error during a test migration, and we needed to defer the majority of items in the nice to have category on account of staff capacity. Migrating 3 databases into one, it was inevitable that we would have duplicate agent and subject records, especially genre-form terms that we would expect to see in each of our repositories, regardless of their unique collecting areas. Inconsistency in practice, both between and within repositories, as well as proficiency with authority control, contributed to a large volume of duplicates, references presented as authorities, agents entered as subjects, subjects entered as agents, and data entry errors. I want to make it clear that this project was not about purity or perfection. It was to improve the experience of processing archivists describing collections, reference archivists directing users toward collections, and users navigating our discovery systems. It was also in service of facilitating linking descriptions of entities or subjects across our repository and beyond in a linked data environment. Ultimately, our cleanup and maintenance work should aim to make our metadata as useful to our staff and user communities as possible. Like the other two presenters, we initially envisioned that this would be background work people could chip away at in between other projects, rather than something people would work on for sustained periods from their homes. But I did want to kind of point out that this is work worth doing. So we wanted to have the computer do the heavy lifting of identifying possible duplicates so that we could focus on a couple thousand of records rather than tens of thousands. An archivist then evaluated a flagged match, decided to either merge the records or keep both, looked up the term in a thesaurus, so primarily Library of Congress or Getty's Art and Architecture, merged the records manually in ArchivesSpace, and made edits to the term we retained if necessary. And we divided this work up across our department. I investigated a few methods for identifying duplicates, and I used a combined approach, but was more successful with OpenRefine. So you can identify a good chunk of duplicate values in Excel through conditional formatting. The benefit of this method is that it's quick and easy. The downside is that the rules are very strict. And so if you have differences in punctuation, in spelling, or spacing, or if you have transposition errors, those will likely not be identified. And from our experience, we had a lot of those. So that is why I prefer OpenRefine, which is a really useful open source application for data cleanup and transformation, which makes it great for metadata remediation. I used the clustering feature by navigating to the column with the name of the agent or the subject term, and then selected Edit Cells, and then Cluster and Edit. OpenRefine has a few clustering methods and algorithms, some more conservative and others more liberal. I'd recommend you start with the default, which I believe is the key collision method using the fingerprint function. Don't worry, you don't need to know what those are or what they do. But that's a pretty strict method. So here are some of the results from this method, which look like the kind of duplicate values I want to catch. But I would encourage you to play around with the different clustering methods available. Some may not be helpful to you, but it's good to see what the possibilities are. So here's the phonetic keying clustering function. And these are not useful results to me because it's looking for similar sounding words. So files, floods, and whales. But this might be useful in a different scenario with different data. But let's go back to that first set of clusters, which is closer to what I wanted. So you can work directly from OpenRefine. You can download these results as a JSON file, or you can copy and paste them into something else like a spreadsheet. You should do whatever works best for you. So I went back to my master export spreadsheets where I had already identified some duplicates using conditional formatting. And then I highlighted these new cells from my OpenRefine results the same color. And I would typically filter by cell color when I worked, just to limit the amount of records I was looking at. So now we had our list of possible duplicates. And when we looked at each of these clusters, we then looked at each of these clusters, evaluated whether or not they were the same thing, and looked up the entry in a thesaurus. Just because you can select the NACO option in a drop-down menu doesn't make it true. We then merged the entries so that the records for the duplicate was linked, so that the records the duplicate was linked to would be linked to the term that we kept. When necessary, we made edits to the entry so that the source of the name or subject heading was accurate, and that the subfields or subdivisions were entered correctly. And we also just did a little bit of spot checking on the remainder of the records for any conspicuous errors, which we viewed as a bonus on top of what we had already addressed. So through this work, we merged over 3,600 duplicate records, edited over 900 entries, and ultimately reduced the number of agent records in our system by over 16%. We didn't always write down if we had made edits, so I'm sure that the number of corrected records is actually well above this. So our edits tended to fall into a few common categories. A number of agent and subject records were initially recorded as being NACO or LCSH, but were actually references rather than authority records. So here's an example of this AFL-CIO agent term, which kind of pings your radar immediately because it seems strange that the authority would be DPT period instead of the full word department. And indeed, you can see that it's a reference rather than an authority. Its purpose is to guide you to the correct heading. So this is a good example of why you should always click all the way through until you open up the actual authority record with the subfields to make sure that you're entering the correct term and entering it correctly. We also corrected records identified as being local names or subjects in ArchivesSpace that had NACO or LCSH authorities. So here we have a suspicious and likely transposed record for Carrie Brownstein, who does indeed have a NACO record. And it's important here to be careful with your assumptions, as lots of folks have the same names. But we checked the collection that this name was linked to, and this does indeed refer to Carrie Brownstein of Slater-Kinney. And vice versa, we had names designated as being NACO or subject headings as LCSH that are actually local terms. We also had agent records that needed to be geographic headings, and this can be a bit confusing because there are a lot of corporate entities where the name component in subfield A is a jurisdictional name. We identified incorrect usage of direct order and missing accent marks and diacritics. And this may feel like a small thing, but these can change the meaning of words. So not taking this seriously suggests that we're not taking people's names seriously. We found a handful of records for people whose death dates had been added to their authorities since we first entered them into our system, and then your garden variety data entry errors. So time will tell, we just finished this, but I think this project will change some of our behaviors. Going forward, we are going to be more careful of imports as many of our duplicate agent terms were created through that workflow. This project was a very helpful reminder that it's best to take care of errors or duplicates as soon as you identify them, as it can be very easy to get distracted by something else and then just forget about it. This was an opportunity for everyone who worked on the project to learn more about name authorities and subject headings and authority control generally. Aspects that maybe felt a little bit confusing before made more sense after this. Distributing the work not only made the project more manageable, but established that it's everyone's responsibility to take care of these records, even if you didn't create them. If you're responsible for cleaning them up, it stands to reason you'll also be less likely to create new duplicates or incorrect records going forward. Ultimately, this was shared work and it's a shared responsibility. This project also surfaced the idea that standards and system functionality need to be considered along local decision-making and individual sense-making on the part of the archivist. So we kept duplicates when one was a topical term and the other was a genre form heading. So here's an example where OpenRefine suggested a duplicate cluster for zines. We have a lot of collections on punk music and culture, particularly Riot Girl. So we want a controlled access point for collections with a good number of zines in them. And we also want an access point if a collection is about zine making, publishing, and distribution as a means of communication and movement building. And those are different things. Working with legacy description has its share of frustrations, but it can also be a time to reassess decisions that might have made sense in a previous context or a previous system, but don't anymore. You can approach the work that was done in the past with both respect and a critical eye. We shouldn't be reckless, but we should also feel empowered by our own expertise. We identified about 100 agent records that should be uniform title subject headings. And we'll definitely change some of those to subjects, but we'll also likely delete those that are not fulfilling the purpose of a uniform title, which is to bring together all manifestations of a given publication. In order for cleanup and maintenance work to make our metadata more useful, there needs to be a sense-making component that draws upon our understanding of not only archival systems and standards, but also our collections and our user communities. So we didn't make everything perfect, but that was never the goal. Sorry, I'm just seeing a message. We'll continue to fix duplicates and errors as we encounter them. And it's a nice reminder to everyone that our collections and metadata are dynamic. Metadata maintenance is ongoing work rather than something that can be undertaken once and considered finished. We have some next steps to build off of this good work. We'll address the duplicates that we missed. We'll take care of the agent records that should be uniform titles, and we'll work on all the subject terms that should be corporate bodies. So New York University and all the subdivisions people have added to them. We want to update the records of a handful of agent records for women who are only identified by their husband's last name. And then we have some other ideas, like reconciling our agent records against Wikidata and LCNEF, reconciling our subject terms against LCSH, and doing some analysis of our subset of local subject terms. So thank you so much for listening. I hope that this was interesting or helpful, maybe both, but I'm happy to answer questions or talk more either in the Q&A or at any time, really. My email's here if you want to get in touch. And I also have a link to our ArchivesSpace LibGuide, guides.nyu.edu/ArchivesSpace. It's where all of our documentation about ArchivesSpace lives. So thank you again.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is Alexander Dury from the New York Public Library Archives Unit. I'm the metadata archivist, and much of my work involves the care and feeding of our various archival systems for description and access. And I'm here today to discuss how we automated date parsing in our ArchivesSpace instance. So we implemented ArchivesSpace ran evaluation and implementation from 2014 until July 2017 when we went live. And during implementation, we had a number of sort of high-level goals and objectives in mind that we wanted to meet. So previously, we have been using a locally developed FileMaker database for managing description. And essentially, one of our goals was, well, we wanted ASpace to we wanted ASpace to be more enjoyable to use and more powerful than what we currently have, so that when we implement, we can, it'll be a step up for us. So we had some high-level goals, such as minimizing repetitive data entry so that data creation and record creation can be essentially fun. To minimize the complexity of processing so that while ASpace gives you an awful lot of descriptive power, it can also be intimidating and can lead to, and sometimes it's entirely possible for even experienced users just be potentially overwhelmed if there's too many options in the record creation. And we also wanted to maximize machine readability so that as archivists went along and processed collections, we're also generating machine readable and machine reusable metadata. One of our goals for this was so that our MARC and EAD records could essentially be complete out of the box, so that as data went between system and system, we knew that we didn't have to worry about data being lost due to machine non-readability. And during our evaluation, we found that the default date forms in ASpace were giving us some problems. We found that the expression fields, which were great for inputting human readable dates, would also require inputting controlled start and end dates. This encouraged double data entry, which will lead to potentially redundant record creation, which was something that we were trying really hard to avoid throughout the system. In addition, it can be complicated to parse more complicated dates. It's entirely possible for two people to, if they want to normalize a complicated date, like say 1980s to May 1995, there are multiple it's entirely possible that multiple interpretations of that, of which none of them are really wrong. However, for the purposes of uniformity and machine readability, we really needed it to be as uniform as possible. And while ASpace, you can create machine readable dates and reusable dates via the start and end fields, it's something that everybody would have to be trained on using and instructed. And again, while it's possible, to go back to the first slide, it could get in the way of sort of the enjoyment of processing. So what we did was we went back and we reviewed the existing functionality that we had for managing metadata. And in our archives portal, our online access and discovery platform, we implemented a Ruby library called Time Twister back in 2016, which would essentially take uncontrolled date strings and transform them into EAD normal fields. As you can see in this example, it would take circa 1965, October 24th, generate a nice ISO 8601 normal field, and assign a certainty to it. This is already in Ruby, so it was already in the correct language for ASpace. And we've already been using it to parse archival dates across our entire metadata corpus, which currently stands at roughly 660,000 parse dates and roughly 10,000 that it was unable to parse, which is a rate that we were very, very happy with. And as you can see from some of the features of it, you can do things like take dates that are single, interpret ranges, interpret things, qualifiers like early, spring, circas. In addition, it supports mods certainty qualifiers such as square brackets and circas and question marks. So essentially, by taking these free text strings and transforming it into machine-readable metadata, we're able to do things such as faceting searches over dates, and knowing that search is going to be accurate and comprehensive. So we asked ourselves, well, we have this date parser we're very happy with, and we have a tool that requires date parsing. So, well, why don't we just put them together? And what we came up with was this ASpace plugin called TimeWalk, which is essentially an ASpace implementation of the existing Time Twister library. It's available on GitHub for download. And essentially what it does is it takes anything in the date expression field and runs various date parsing rules to transform it into the machine readable start, end, and certainty values, as well as auto-generating the calendar and Gregorian calendar and the CE era. So essentially by just inputting the expression, ArchivesSpace will now generate the entire control date value fields. And since we no longer need it for most users to use these extended controlled fields, we ended up removing them from the SUI. So essentially, when you go, and as you can see, when you go to create a date, you just see the expression and the type for either inclusive or bulk. And on save, it creates the entire machine-readable date form. As you can see, we have the correct certainty, the label creation, the type, so that this is ready to go for EAD export, and also for running tools such as the collection date calculator. So for that, we don't have to do anything special. It just works out of the box now. So we found that the benefits of this are that data entry is much simpler. It's made training and learning ArchivesSpace much easier for new users, since instead of having to train and document on the date field, it can just simply be take the expression, put in the dates as per existing best cataloging or descriptive practice, and then the machine does the rest of the work for you. So essentially, we get all the benefits of machine readability without without front loading all the work onto the user. In addition, since all the dates are being parsed along the same rules, we know that all of our dates are going to be machine readable in the same way. The small differences between how two users might interpret the same date just don't really exist when it's just the one parser, which has been really great since it means that our search faceting again is comprehensive and uniform, and tools like the date calculator are always going to work the same way. And finally, we found that by simplifying the SUI, it can now live up to that ArchivesSpace slogan of being your friendly archives management system. It's much easier, it's much friendlier and less intimidating for new users. And it helps them sort of jump right into the flow of record creation without needing a lot of specialized training on working with on cataloging standards for dates. If you're interested in using it, the installation for a plugin is actually quite simple. You can just download the files from the GitHub repository and put them into a TimeWalk directory within your plugins folder. You just have to add in the TimeWalk title to your plugins list in your config.rb file, and then restart, and then you're done. Once that's done, then from that point forwards, any new dates that you create are going to be automatically parsed. If you're using a hosted instance, it should be no problem at all to have this set up. There is, however, one caveat to this, which is that so the plugin will parse any new dates quite well, but it won't go back and reparse old dates. Since what it does is whenever a record is saved, it'll find the date and parse it and save the enhanced description. So what you'll need to do is for older metadata, you'll need to go back and essentially open and save them. For collections, this might not be a big deal to do manually. Or if you have, certain components that you say, okay, this one actually has kind of these like complicated dates, I want to manually reparse it. But if you want to do it for your entire repository's worth of metadata, it's probably best done via the API at that point. There's a really fantastic article in the Code for Lib journal by Alicia Detelich, who's coincidentally coming up next, about doing this exact process. If you're looking for a process to sort of learn the API in a way that's going to be essentially something that's going to have long-term benefits, but also doesn't require a lot of high-risk data rewriting, this is actually a really fantastic first-time project. Since if you essentially copy out and resave a record, you won't be changing existing data, but it'll automatically enhance it. There may be tricks within the staff interface to essentially resave lots of records at once, which would update your, reparse the dates. If you find them, please let me know. I'll be very excited to know about it. An easy way to do this. And yeah, thank you very much for listening today. Also like to thank the staff across NYPL for their feedback and their feedback and patience with the development process of this tool. And to the many contributors to the Time Twister and Time Walk libraries who have been absolutely invaluable in improving these tools. And if you have any questions about about dates in general, about these plugins, setting up, etc., you're more than welcome to contact me, and I'll be thrilled to talk about it. Thank you.
Oh, gotta unmute myself. Hi, everybody. My name is Alicia Detelich. As Jessica said, I am a metadata archivist in Manuscripts and Archives at Yale Sterling Memorial Library. I want to thank Jessica and the ArchivesSpace team for organizing this. It's been really great, and thanks to everyone also who presented before me. So I am going to give a really quick and dirty intro to using the ArchivesSpace API by way of a simple and really common archival task, which is updating container numbers, specifically boxes. So the demos aim towards archivists who have an interest in automated data cleanup, but who don't necessarily have a lot of experience or a high level of comfort doing it themselves. Hopefully this will clear up some of the mystery surrounding this kind of work and empower you to get started yourself. It's also something that can be done at home, which is obviously pretty relevant these days. So because this talk is so short, I have to skip over some of the technical details of why things are working the way that they do. But the idea here is kind of give you some practical experience, which will hopefully inspire you to explore this stuff in more detail. So many of us have faced situations where, for instance, we've just entered hundreds of boxes and folders into ArchivesSpace, linked them to archival object records, and then found 10, 20, or 100 more boxes in the next room that we need to integrate into this collection. Or a donor has dropped off some more boxes and we've decided that we want to integrate this. So in a lot of cases, what it ends up coming out as is these 6A, 18A, blah, blah, blah. And this can get very unwieldy depending on how many boxes you actually have. And it's not great for reporting. It's not great for sorting and all that. And so it's basically not ideal. In another situation similar, you might have a collection that you just reprocessed or performed additional work on, and some or all of the box numbers might have changed as part of that process. These are two situations that have come up really recently at our institution, and I imagine yours as well. So while it could take hours to manually renumber all of these things in the staff interface, which often means that it doesn't get done at all, the same work can be done in just a few minutes via the API. If you want to follow along, I have this tutorial here which explains the process. I put this together for our staff a while ago, and it includes some demo files that you can practice with. I'm going to be using a Mac, but the process is pretty much the same for Windows. The main difference is the way that file paths are formatted. And with Windows, you'll use the Anaconda prompt, while on a Mac, you'll use the terminal. So to start, what you'll do is clone or download this repository and save it somewhere that you can access it. And I have some videos here which can kind of show you how to do all that. So we're going to be using a program called Miniconda to interact with the API. It's a Python virtual environment that includes some of the most common third-party packages that are used in data processing and manipulation. I explain a bit more in this README what Miniconda is and why you should use it and how you can install it. So that's for your reference. Once we have Miniconda installed, if you're on a Windows machine, you're going to want to find the Anaconda prompt or the Anaconda PowerShell and click on that. If you're on a Mac, then what you can do is just open a terminal window. And I can, oh, not this one. I can show you basically on a Mac. So you'll search this terminal, it'll come up. And what you can do to make sure that you have the right Python installation is type in which Python, and you'll see Miniconda is installed here. And on either a Mac or a Windows machine, you can type in conda list, and you can make sure that you have everything that you need installed. And so especially this requests thing here. And so now that you have this environment set up, all you really need to do is type in Python into your either your terminal or your Anaconda prompt. And then you can start entering commands into the Python interpreter. And you can tell you're in there by these 3 dots here. And then you can start running commands. This is another command that you can use to check where your Python installation is. And so in addition to this Python interpreter, you can also run Python scripts, so Python files, these py files here, from the command line. And you can also import them into the interpreter or into other Python files, which facilitates their sharing and reuse by other parts of Python. So to exit the interpreter and get back to the command line so that we can try running a py file, you can just press quit, and that will take you back to your command line interface. And so to run your first command line script, the first thing you're going to want to do is change directories to the folder where your files are stored. So in this case, this is the demo files directory, and you can see what you have in this directory by typing in ls. And this is all on the command line, not in the Python interpreter. And so you can see that you have all of these files here. And because you are in the same directory where these files are stored, all you need to do to run it is type in Python and then the name of the script that you want to run. So in this case, helloworld.py. It will run the script, show the output on the command line, and it basically runs this file. Okay, so that's your first command line script. That's great. And so to actually connect, so we're going to be doing that more in a little bit, which is what I wanted to show you. So once you have that, you can actually try connecting to the API. And so what you'll first need to do is enter your login data into this config.json file. You enter the API URL, which if you don't know that and you're hosted, you can ask your hosting provider, or you can ask your IT person, or you can ask me if you want. I can probably help you with that. And then your username and password will be the same basically as your login for the staff interface. So what you're going to want to do is open a Python interpreter again. And the first thing you'll do, you run a couple lines of code, and this will basically import a couple of libraries. And so the JSON library basically allows you to interact with the JSON data that comes out of ArchivesSpace. And the request library, which comes with Miniconda, is basically facilitates HTTP requests, which allow you to communicate back and forth with the API. So you import that, and then the next thing you're going to do is import this ArchivesSpace login file. And that actually is this file here, in which I've already put the code in that will read the JSON file with your login information and log you into the ArchivesSpace API. And so you'll import that, and then you'll basically copy this line of code, if it'll run. And what this essentially does is executes the login script, logs into the API, and it saves the API URL and your authentication data in these variables, which essentially just are symbols that store some data so that you can reuse them later. And so, for instance, you type in API URL, you see your API URL, and then you see the authentication data here that you got back from the API when you sent your request. And so now you're logged into the API. So that's excellent. So now let's try getting some top container data. The first thing you're going to do here is import your pprint module, which is another built-in module. I'd like to actually take a second here. So one of the really cool things about Python are these libraries. Some are built-in, some are third-party, and they're basically like files which contain code either written in Python or C, which provide, kind of extend the functionality of like the base Python language. And so it is really nice because it adds a lot of functionality, and it keeps you from having to rewrite code that other people have already written. So it's a huge time saver, and it's one of the things that makes Python a really good language for people who have never really done programming before. So the pprint module just basically will give you some pretty printing so that you can see things nicely on the screen. This here, you'll define your top container URI. So basically everything in ArchivesSpace via the API is identified through a URI. And this corresponds to the database identifier. You can also see it here in this staff interface view. So what you'll do is you'll define this, and then you actually send a request to the API. You put in your API URL symbol here, or variable here, and the URI. You pass in your authentication data, and then you request your response back in JSON. And so what you end up getting after you submit is this bit of JSON. Okay. So, so JSON objects are really similar structure to a data type in Python called a dictionary. And there's a lot more on all of this to explore. And this contains basically key value pairs. And so you'll see this is a key, this indicator value, and then the value is 1. And this corresponds basically to the top container data in the staff interface, which I can't get to because of, so yeah, indicator 1 essentially corresponds to what's here. Okay. And so to actually update these indicators, what you're gonna do is you're gonna take this data, and because again, Python has some built-in methods for managing this data, it's pretty easy to manipulate it. So for instance, to access this indicator, you use this straight bracket and it will give you the value. And so that corresponds to box 1 here. And so say you want to change this, what you can do is do this again and just use this equal sign and assignment to change that. And then if you print it again, you'll see that it's been changed to 1A. And then if you want to post that to the ArchivesSpace API, you formulate your request very similar to how you retrieved the data, the API URL and the top container URI. The main difference here is that in addition to your authentication data, you will also insert your top container JSON into the request so that it knows kind of what to do here. And so then you'll see what comes out of this is this updated record. And if you look in the staff interface, look, you can update a single record. And so that is the process for updating a single record. But with just a few more lines of code, we can update many records at once using a spreadsheet as input. And most of us are already really comfortable using spreadsheets, and they work really well with Python. So this is great. So first, what we need to do is actually retrieve the data that we want to update and get it into a spreadsheet in order to use it for the upload. So the easiest way to do this is through the database, but it's also really easy to do it through the API, and not everybody has access to the database. So I'm just going to go through the API method. So The most important thing to do is retrieve the URIs for all the records that you want to update, just as you did with the single record. It's also helpful to retrieve the current box number so that you can keep track of what you're updating, because the URIs themselves don't really tell you a whole lot. And so to get the data that you need, you're going to need to use the search endpoint, which is shown down here, and that's a link to the API reference. And so you can, if you want, just to copy and paste this into the Python interpreter. But what I've actually done is put this all into its own script, the retrieve top container data.py file, so that you can run it from the Anaconda prompt or the terminal, and it actually does some of that manipulation into a spreadsheet for you. So here's the query, and then a little bit of CSV data. You'll run that, and what it ends up coming out with, so it'll prompt you to enter a name for your CSV file, and then it's going to want you to enter a URI for your resource, which corresponds to this here in your URL. And then, because basically it's going to retrieve all the top containers associated with the resource and all of the archival objects under that resource as well. And so what ends up coming out is you have this spreadsheet with all your container numbers. And then I have this other column here where we're going to add our new data. So basically all you really need to do to prepare the data for update is add this in and then just fill down. And I mean, you may have variations on this, but it's pretty much as easy as that. And then once you have that, we can start doing the actual bulk upload. And so I have here another, you can also type this into the interpreter if you'd like, but I tend to think that, working from a PY file is a little bit easier to reuse, and if you make mistakes, it's less challenging to come back from. So basically, what you'll do, and I want to show you kind of what's happening in this really quick. So the big difference between this and updating the single record is that essentially you're ingesting a CSV file. It's going to read the CSV, and it's going to do what's called a for loop over each row of the CSV. So it's going to process each row and run a bit of code on each row of the spreadsheet. And so for each row of the spreadsheet, it essentially does what we did when we updated the single record. So it identifies the top container URI, it identifies the new box number, it requests the JSON record, it replaces the existing indicator with the new box number, and then you post it back, including your top container JSON. And then once it does that, you'll actually see these updates here if it's successful. If it's not successful, you'll also know that. And then once you're done, you can check in the staff interface and it is done. And so you have all your boxes updated. And so that's pretty much it. Like I said, like super quick and dirty. But I wanted to mention that the general process that I've explained here can be applied to a lot of other record types and fields in ArchivesSpace. So updating titles and identifiers in archival object records is a very similar process. Adding dates and other subrecords is somewhat different, but it's generally similar to this. And I thought that this would be kind of an easy way to familiarize yourself with the general process and get some real work done. I also have a few kind of safety tips to mention at the bottom that you can review yourself, as well as some helpful resources for more information about Python and all that. And of course, if you have any questions, please let me know. My contact information is a lot of different places. Thanks.
Thank you, Alicia, and thank you, everyone. That was really great. We're going to go ahead and open the floor to questions and comments. There are already a lot of questions in the Q&A. We're going to try, we only have 8 minutes. We're going to try to answer them as quickly as possible. We will make our way through all of the questions, so I completely understand that some of you may have to go before all of the questions get answered. So in the Q&A, the first question, this is for Abby. We have a similar workflow, but of course anyone can answer. We have a similar workflow to DPL for uploading legacy finding aids in ASpace. How difficult was it for you to identify which collections and legacy finding aids, which collections had legacy finding aids that needed this work done to them?
Okay, thanks for the question. To identify the collections that had legacy finding aids, most of them we were pretty familiar with because we're a very user-driven institution. And so we're often collectively really aware of the collections that need work. And we're able to create priority lists based on user feedback. So the great thing about our institution, I guess our perspective is that archivists are also doing public work in the special collections reading room. So we're very tied in with the end user. I would say that was our number one way. We just kind of created ad hoc priorities from our own experience and types of inquiries that we were seeing. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Next question is there a list of speakers and titles of their presentation anywhere? So that reminds me, this is being recorded. The recording will be made available with all of the presentations from all of the presenters and Alicia's GitHub resource. So all of that will be made available on our website and via our YouTube. Okay, next question. Is there a way to use OpenRefine to detect and merge duplicate top containers within resources? And then Amanda Falk has responded to that and said, we have a Python script which looks for that and makes a report. So Amanda, if you have that anywhere publicly available and you'd like to share that link, please feel free. Otherwise, I think that may be directed at Rachel, but if anyone wants to answer.
I'm sorry, which one are we looking at?
Oh, sorry. Is there a way to use OpenRefine to detect and merge duplicate top containers within resources? I only said you talked about OpenRefine.
I haven't been using this for top containers. Maybe this came up when Megan was talking about that. But perhaps if you have barcode information, then that could be useful in identifying your duplicates.
Next question. When cleaning up subject headings, I wish ASpace would permit access to the full subject heading record from browse mode. Our database has multiple similar subject headings, but the type varies from record to record. It is difficult to browse the correct headings as it is not visible from the browse dropdown. So there are several comments on this. So I'm going to read those. Malaka says, once you've done a browse subject, you can then filter by term type first. For example, if you had zines as a topical and as a genre, the term type filter will have a choice for topical and genre. Nancy adds, we had a lot of this and it made cleanup hard. We added a plugin to insert columns to our subject browse view so we could have columns for terms, identifier, source, and term type. It's been a bit easier to spot errors with type on screen, so the first term type. Nancy, if you want have a link to that plugin that you'd like to submit in the chat, that would probably be great. And it sounds like lots of people are frustrated by this, so keep in mind that you can always put in a feature request, submit a JIRA ticket for a feature request via our website. So if anyone is interested in doing that. All right. Amanda asks, for those who did name and subject cleanup manually, did you consider using the ASpace API to write your edits back to the system from your spreadsheet? The manual update seems safer and you might discover other issues, but it's also tempting to explore writing the updates back via the API. Scary though for me.
I can answer. So yeah, I initially envisioned doing something like that, and it's a little bit outside of my area of expertise, but the kind of blocker, at least in my case, doing that was needing to retain all of the different links to accession, resource, digital object, and event records that those agent or subject records had across multiple repositories. And I wasn't able to clearly identify a way to do that via the API. So that's what made doing the work manually preferable from my end, at least. But if anyone is keen to figure out how to do that, I think a lot of people would like that.
Similar for me, our metadata archivist is working on skills for using the API and figuring out how to generate things that we want that isn't native in ArchivesSpace, but has just started having like the time to turn her attention to that. And it's not something that I have a lot of experience with either. So given that I wanted to get on a project right away after coming home, and also that it had been 1.5 years since our migration, it just seems actually more prudent in terms of time to do it the way I knew how. But I second Rachel that I'm sure a workaround like that would be useful.
I'll mention just quickly that we have done some API updates to edit agent records, and I think I may have some scripts. If you're interested, feel free to get in touch with me. This is Alicia.
Thank you all. Thanks. And I think something that was pretty refreshing about this webinar was that it did highlight there are a lot of different ways to accomplish goals in ArchivesSpace when planning these projects. So yeah, sometimes you have to go the manual way, but there are other options. We've gotten a comment that please identify yourself when answering a question. So if you do chime in with an answer, panelist, if you would please identify yourself. Rachel, how are you planning to address the Mrs. So-and-so issue for more obscure donors and sources? Do you have a plan for tackling that?
Hi, this is Rachel. I think what we're going to do is for the locally created names that we have, just do a little bit of research and digging and try and find those people's first names and then correct their entries. If they were important enough to be given an access point as either a creator or a donor or a subject of a collection, we would hope we'd be able to find their first names. And if it is a NACO, like an authorized term, we're going to talk to one of our librarians who is more of an authority on authorities about what we can do there.
This is Megan. I can also respond a little bit because I did encounter this cleaning up the subset of agents that I worked on, and it was kind of interesting because sometimes the name was spelled out in the bio note and the finding aid, but just not as the linked source. And sometimes that was a result of additions coming later. And the initial, accession source just hadn't been updated. But also it was just a lot of Googling, Ancestry, etc., to try to find. There's still 1 or 2 left in there that I couldn't find the full name anywhere on the internet.
Thanks. All right. Next question. We discovered that single dates migrated as ranges, so are expressed as 1956 to 1956 instead of 1956, for example. Any advice on how to fix that globally?
Hey, this is Alex. That's a really good question. Other than getting into the weeds of the database or all I could think of would be pulling all your records out via the API and doing like automated comparisons to see if like begin and end are the same. But in general, that's a good question. I don't think it harms anything, so I think as long as the expression is fine, I don't. Yeah, I think as long as the expression's fine, as long as the faceting's fine, it may, but yeah, I think it have to do it via some sort of like API process of like extraction, comparison, and resaving. Sorry, I don't have like a better answer, but that's all I can think of right now.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks for taking a stab at it. And if anyone that's still here would like to comment on that question, if they have any suggestions, please feel free. We're going to move on to the next.
This is Alicia, and that's pretty much the process that I use, just comparing the begin and end date. And if they're the same, then doing another update to delete the end date and change it to single. But yeah, it's the best way I could think of to do it is through the API.
Thanks. The next question is from Brian. It says, save individual archival objects or just the high level collection? I'm not sure what that's in reference to. Does anyone on the panel, does that look familiar to what you presented on? Time Twister for old records. Thank you, Brian. So for Time Twister for old records, save individual archival object or just the high level collection? Alex?
Yeah, this is Alex. I think you may have to save individual archival objects, although I'm not entirely sure what kicks off like a bulk save within a collection or a resource. So it'll be something you have to experiment with, but it may be possible to update an entire resource's worth of objects at once. I just don't know how. I just don't know how to do it offhand.
Thanks, Alex. So still more for lots of questions coming up about for Alex. So what do you do when Time Twister can't interpret free text dates?
So in these cases, so administrators can always go in and they'll still have access to the extended date fields to manually punch in the controlled values. If a date is truly something that can't go into ISO 8601, if, for example, there's no year, or you have like a year and a day but no month, in those cases, it may be better just to leave it uncontrolled, since I found in my experience that it's better to try to just leave things, if you can't make a certain parsing into 8601, it's better to leave it as is than try to like force fit it into something that like isn't really going to work. Archives are uncertain and messy, and it's probably better. And I found it's better just to leave these things as they are, instead of sort of like making up, trying to do things, then essentially trying to force things into a format they may not necessarily belong into.
Thanks. Next question, also for Alex. Have you run into any issues when a date is incorrectly parsed? If so, how would you correct it with the machine readable fields no longer available? Export and modify the EAD? Thanks.
So again, you can always log in as administrator to make the changes. It's happened I think it's happened maybe once or twice in the 3 years we've been using it. But if anything ever does go wrong, you could always just log in as administrator, make the fixes, and the plugin won't overwrite any changes that you make manually. So if something does go wrong, you can always make a manual fix.
Thanks. Amanda asks, are there talks about making box renumbering in the staff interface easier without the API? In Archon, it was very simple.
Jessica, this is Christine, the program manager for ArchivesSpace. I did just this minute typed an answer in there. There is a feature request for that. I put the link in there. We do have, I mentioned in a different answer that Harvard is working on a larger project related to different improvements for working with container information and location information. We held off on working on that particular one related to updating indicators to see what might come in through that. So we're still kind of holding off on that, but some improvements may come in with the Harvard project, and some we would wait for the dust to sort of settle on that, and then we might be able to do more with that. But feel free, please, to enter a comment onto that issue if you have things to say about it.
Thanks, Christine. Lots of questions are getting answered in the chat, so if you aren't keeping up with the chat, please do review the answered questions. I'm not going to read them and answer them just in the interest of time. We're already over. So we're going to do 2 more questions. One is actually something that popped in the chat, but it's worth asking. Just for if someone could please provide the definition of crosswalk. What does it mean to crosswalk a standard? I thought Alex would jump at that one.
Oh, sure. Yeah, this is Alex. So crosswalk essentially maps one metadata schema into another. So for example, if we're going from, say, a EAD to MARC, essentially the crosswalk is what gets, is what will say that, the 3xx fields belong in, the extend and physdesk, for example. Essentially the mapping that goes from essentially the mapping from one metadata schema into another, so that the metadata all gets into the right place, so that the new format doesn't lose anything from the old format.
Yeah. Thanks, Alex. And then we're going to finish with one more question. For those who have done a phased migration to ASpace, how did you decide what tasks, like migrate legacy, accessions, migrate EAD, will be part of what phases, and how did the phases overlap?
This is Megan. I can talk a little bit about that. I wasn't part of the decision. The business case had been in the works for a long time before I got to Emory. But I think essentially we were not, as I mentioned, in a centralized collection management tool like Archivist Toolkit. So moving to ArchivesSpace was going to change how we do our work an enormous amount. And so I think the feeling was, let's change our work a little bit more slowly in ways that are manageable, so that not everything would change all at once, and we could sort of get our feet wet with one set of functions before moving on to putting all of our archival collection management into the system. So that's why we focused on putting accessioning into the system first, and then we'll move on to doing resources and a subject management later for part of phase 2. Another related issue was the PUI and coming to an agreement about how we would implement the interface to replace Emory finding aids or whatever later on. So there's just a lot of decisions that we didn't want to make all those decisions in the beginning, and we didn't want to totally uproot our sort of working lives all at once. And obviously the phases have not overlapped at all yet because phase 2 has not even begun. The business case is still moving through the system. So yeah.
I could make a quick comment on that. For the this is Abby Haverstock from Denver Public Library. One thing that we initially wanted to do was, of course, upload our EAD finding aids, our most processed collections. But I think after that, we had an ad hoc system that was partly connected to new collections that were being added to. So if we had a new accrual to an existing donation, that needed to be accessioned. And at that point, we just figured that was a good moment to go ahead and fully flesh out that particular resource record. Not necessarily process the collection, but finish its resource record to the extent that we could. So part of it was just driven by timing and donors, things that actually came in to us.
Thanks. We are going to go ahead and stop with the Q&A. I think that all of the questions have either been addressed in the chat or live. We did get a question about downloading the chat. So a copy of the Q&A with all of the answers will be made available with the recording. So you will be able, if you're not able to get through all of this content right now, you can look at that later. That'll definitely be made available with the recording. But I want to thank all of you for being here and for sticking it out to the very end. And a really big thank you to all of our presenters. This was really great. And it was nice to hear what everybody is doing in their own environments right now while we work under such different conditions. Thanks, everybody.